This video was brought to you by Ground News. Austria's politics rarely make the international headlines. It's a small country of less than 10 million people, and for all of its post-war history, power has oscillated between the Conservative People's Party and the centre-left Social Democrats. However, for the last few years, the People's Party has been consumed by scandals, and the Social Democrats have been beset by infighting, which has only continued since they elected a self-described Marxist as their leader earlier this year. Now, this chaos has benefited a series of non-mainstream parties, including the Austrian Communists and the Beer Party. But it's especially benefited the radically right-wing FPO, who have historically had close ties to Putin and spend a lot of time talking about the apparent threat of Muslim immigration. So in this video, we're going to take a look at the scandals that broke Austrian politics, how they've supercharged the FPO, and what might happen next. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. Let's start with the scandals. The first of these scandals, known as the Ibiza affair, came in 2019, when German media published a secretly recorded video of then Vice President Heinz Christian Strache, who was the leader of the minor party in Austria's right-wing coalition, the Freedom Party, or FPO. In the video, which was recorded in Ibiza in 2017, Strache is seen negotiating with a woman he believed was the niece of a Russian oligarch, where he discussed providing the FPO with positive news coverage in return for government contracts. Now, after the video came out, Strache accused the media of a political assassination, but he did eventually resign, and the coalition government collapsed soon after, leading to a snap election. At those elections, the FPO lost a number of votes to their former coalition partner, the centre-right People's Party, led by Sebastian Kurz, who ultimately won nearly 38% of the vote, giving them 71 seats in Austria's 183-seat National Assembly. The People's Party then went on to form a two-party coalition with the Austrian Green Party, who had their best ever result, with 14% of the vote. Now, this might sound like a bit of a weird alliance, given that the People's Party are pretty conservative, while the Greens are pretty left-wing. But it was sort of the only option left, given that Kurz had also ruled out a grand coalition with the Social Democrats. Anyway, the new People's Party Green coalition was sworn in early 2020, with Kurz as Chancellor, and Strache was then jailed a year later in 2021 for corruption crimes related to the Ibiza affair. And at the time, it looked like Austrian politics might finally be back to normal. But in October 2021, only 18 months after the government was sworn in, Kurz was forced to resign after Austria's anti-corruption authorities raided his office on the suspicion that he'd misused government funds to pay for flattering opinion polling while he was vying for the chancellery in 2016. The case then took a dramatic turn last year, when a former colleague testified against him, and the repercussions of all of this have been rippling through Austrian politics ever since. Multiple People's Party officials had to resign due to their ties to the scandal, and last year, editors at two of the country's major media outlets were also forced to resign, after it was revealed that they'd been sending overly cozy texts to senior People's Party politicians. Then, just last week, Kurz was indicted yet again, this time for allegedly making false statements to a parliamentary inquiry in 2020. You get the idea then. Austrian politics has been struck by a series of scandals since 2019, and the People's Party have been essentially unable to recover. Originally, they replaced Kurz with Foreign Minister Alexander Schallenberg, but he was kicked out just a few weeks later after he failed to secure the support of the party's state governors. Schallenberg was then replaced by Interior Minister Karl Nehammer, who was originally pretty popular, but today has one of Europe's lowest approval ratings. And that is largely because the People's Party is still marred in scandal, but also because, like basically every other government in Europe, he's been unable to get a handle on inflation. which hit a peak of 11.2% in January and is still running at 7%. Nehammer then hit the headlines once again last year when, in an off-color joke, he said that people would have to resort to either alcohol or psychotropic drugs if inflation doesn't come down soon. Now, you might expect the People's Party's woes to benefit the Social Democrats, given that they've traditionally been the other big party in Austrian politics. But the Social Democrats have also been beset by infighting in the past few years, mostly over the issue of immigration. And early this year, they made matters yet more complicated by electing a controversial new leader called Andreas Babler. Babler is sort of the Austrian equivalent of Jeremy Corbyn. He's a self-described Marxist who wants Austria to accept more refugees, increase welfare spending, and who once described the EU as the most aggressive military alliance that's ever existed, and, quote, worse than NATO. And his politics apparently aren't all that popular in Austria either. According to Politico's poll of polls, the Social Democrats have fallen from a peak of about 30% last year to nearer 20% today. Now, perhaps unsurprisingly, this chaos surrounding the two major parties has generated an immense amount of anti-establishment sentiment, which has benefited more unorthodox parties. Last year, for example, the Austrian Beer Party, which promises to build an outdoor beer fountain in Vienna and vehemently opposes shandies, hit 10% in a couple of polls. And its founder, known by his stage name Marco Pogo, won 8.3% of the vote in 2022's presidential election. Similarly, while polling suggests that the Austrian Communist Party are only on about 3% of the vote, they've been performing remarkably well at state-level elections, winning the mayoral race in Graz, Austria's second-largest city, and getting 12% of the vote in Salzburg. But perhaps the biggest beneficiary of all of this chaos has been the FPO. Yep, that's right, the very same FPO who were caught up in the Ibiza affair in 2019 and arguably kicked off all of this chaos. And 4 years later, it's as if the Ibiza affair never happened, and the FPO are riding high in the polls on 30%, as well as dominating Austria's state-level elections. The FPO had their first real taste of power in 1999, when under their charismatic leader Jörg Haider, they came second with 27% of the vote, and went on to form a two-party coalition with the People's Party. At the time, the FPO's radical right-wing politics and their Nazi past was so controversial in Europe that 14 other EU member states effectively cut diplomatic ties with Austria. Today, though, the FPO has made political hay by attacking the government on lockdown measures, inflation, and Austria's cooperation with NATO members, which the FPO see as a threat to Austria's neutrality. For context, the FPO have also historically been pretty pro-Russia. They signed a cooperation agreement with Putin's United Russia Party in 2016, and walked out when Zelensky spoke to the Austrian parliament earlier this year. They also really don't like Muslim immigration, and they're relatively Eurosceptic, proposing that the euro be split into a hard North euro and a soft South euro. And it doesn't look like any of this is set to resolve anytime soon, with the next election looking like it's going to end in deadlock, because the People's Party have ruled out giving them the chancellery, but the FPO's leader have stressed that they won't accept anything less. Ultimately, it's already worth paying attention to Austria at the moment more than ever, with their politics heating up and potentially having ramifications for the EU, NATO, and the war in Ukraine. And the best way to do that is with ground news, so a website and app developed by a former NASA engineer on a mission to give readers an easy, data-driven, and objective way of reading the news. That's because every story comes with a visual breakdown of the political bias, factuality, and ownership of the source's reporting, all backed by ratings from 3 independent news monitoring organizations. It's not just that either. I especially like their blind spot feature, which highlights stories disproportionately covered by one side of the political spectrum. For example, this story on rising water temperatures in the Gulf Coast is a blind spot for the right. So if you only get your news from right-leaning sources, you might have totally missed this. Meanwhile, this story on China's proposed training facility in Cuba is a blind spot for the left, so you might have missed that story instead. Now, you may be thinking, why should I be paying attention to partisan sources at all? Well, part of being informed about the world around us is also being informed of potential political slants and echo chambers. That's because if we know where these views are coming from, we'll be better equipped to not only spot ongoing bias, but to engage in healthy dialogue with those who hold different views. In fact, I know I've personally benefited a whole lot from ground news. I've gotten much better at spotting political bias, and I've surprisingly challenged some of my own views too. As such, I highly encourage our viewers to give ground news a try. We're even offering a 30% discount on their Vantage plan for all TLDR viewers. And that includes access to a feature called My News Bias, which is basically a dashboard for your news diet. Sign up to find out how your reading habits change over the next week. What are your top sources? Are you engaging with diverse perspectives? What about your favorite topics? Find out with Ground News Vantage, which is 30% off only using our link. So make sure that you go to ground.news/TLDR or click the link in the description to get started and support an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent.